The glass slipped from Eleanor Bright's fingers before she even felt it leave her hand, and the sound of it shattering against the marble floor cut through the music like a blade. Every head in the grand hall of Ambervale House turned toward her at once. Wine spread across the stone in a dark red pool, and for one long, terrible moment, nobody said a word. Then the laughter began. It started as a ripple, a few muffled snorts behind gloved hands, and grew quickly into open amusement. Lady Caroline Hunt, standing near the fireplace in a gown the color of spring leaves, did not even try to hide her smile. "Careful, Miss Bright," she called out, loud enough for half the room to hear. "One might think you had never held a glass before in your life." More laughter followed. Eleanor felt her face grow warm, but she did not let it show. She had learned long ago how to keep her expression calm, even when her chest felt tight enough to break. She bent down, gathered the broken pieces of glass with steady hands, and rose again with her chin lifted. "My apologies," she said quietly to the nearest servant, who hurried forward with a cloth. "I was clumsy. It will not happen again." But it would happen again. It always did. This was the fourth event this season where Eleanor had stumbled, dropped something, or misjudged a step on the dance floor. Each time, the whispers grew louder. Each time, her mother's smile grew tighter and more forced, a mask stretched thin over quiet embarrassment. Eleanor had stopped trying to explain herself months ago. There was no explanation that society would accept, not one that made sense to people who had never known real danger in their lives. She made her way toward the edge of the hall, away from the crowd, and found a quiet space near one of the tall windows. Outside, the gardens of Ambervale House stretched into darkness, lit here and there by lanterns strung along the paths. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and breathed slowly, counting the seconds the way she always did when the noise inside her chest grew too loud. It was there, in that quiet corner, that she felt someone watching her. She turned and found the Duke of Ambervale standing several feet away, a glass of his own held loosely in one hand, his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not quite name. He was not laughing. He was not smiling with pity, the way some of the older ladies did when they thought no one was looking. He was simply watching her, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle only he could see. Alistair Vane, Duke of Ambervale, was not a man given to idle staring. Eleanor knew this much about him from the little gossip she had gathered since arriving in London for the season. He was known to be reserved, careful with his words, and slow to offer his opinion on anything. He had inherited his title young, after his father's sudden passing, and had spent the years since managing his estates with a steadiness that impressed even his harshest critics. And yet here he was, looking at her as though she were the only person in the entire hall worth noticing. "You handle disaster well, Miss Bright," he said at last, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the distant music. Eleanor blinked, caught off guard. "I do not know if I would call spilled wine a disaster, Your Grace. I was not speaking of the wine." Something in the way he said it made her chest tighten in a different way than before. She studied his face, searching for mockery, for the same cruel amusement she had seen in Lady Caroline's eyes only minutes ago, but there was none. His expression was steady, almost solemn, as though he carried some private knowledge he had not yet decided to share. "I am afraid I do not understand you, Your Grace," she said carefully. "Perhaps not yet." He inclined his head toward her, a small, formal gesture, and then added, "Forgive me. I did not mean to trouble you further tonight. You have had enough of that already." He turned as if to leave, and Eleanor found herself speaking before she could stop the words. "Why were you watching me?" He paused. For a moment she thought he might simply walk away without answering, the way most gentlemen would when a question grew too direct for comfort. Instead, he turned back to face her fully. "Because you remind me of someone," he said. "Someone who once stood very still in the middle of chaos, when everyone around them had lost their composure entirely." Eleanor's heart gave an odd, uneven beat. "I am afraid I have never met you before tonight, Your Grace. I would remember a duke." "No," he agreed softly. "You would not remember me, but I remember you." Before she could ask what he meant, Lady Caroline appeared at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as though she had every right to be there. "Your Grace, you must come and settle a small dispute. Lord Ashford insists the new dance from Vienna is nothing but a scandal, and I am determined to prove him wrong." The Duke's expression shifted instantly, smoothing into the polite, distant mask that Eleanor had come to expect from every gentleman in this world. He offered Eleanor a brief bow, "Miss Bright," and then he was gone, swept away into the crowd by Lady Caroline's confident hand, leaving Eleanor alone by the window with her heart pounding and 100 unanswered questions circling in her mind. She watched him go, watched the way the crowd parted for him without effort, the way every eye in the room seemed to follow his path even as they pretended not to notice. He was the most important man at this gathering, perhaps the most important man in all of London this season, and yet for one strange, unguarded moment, he had looked at her as though she mattered more than any of it. Her brother Edmund found her a short while later, still standing near the window, her wine glass replaced but untouched in her hand. "There you are," he said, his voice carrying the familiar warmth she had known her whole life. "Mother has been asking after you. I told her you had simply stepped away for air, though I suspect she already knows about the glass." "She knows," Eleanor said quietly. "Everyone knows. I doubt there is a single person in this hall who does not know by now." Edmund's smile faded slightly. He studied her for a moment, the way only a brother who had grown up beside her could, seeing past the calm surface to the tension underneath. "Your leg is troubling you again." "It is fine, Eleanor. It is fine, Edmund." She said it firmly enough that he did not press further, though the concern in his eyes did not fully disappear. Only Edmund knew the truth of what had happened 3 years ago, the accident that had changed everything about how her body moved through the world. Only Edmund understood why sometimes, without warning, her balance simply failed her, why a single misstep could send her stumbling in front of an entire room of strangers who saw nothing but clumsiness where there was, in truth, an old and stubborn injury that refused to fully heal. She had told no one else. Not because she was ashamed of what had happened, but because the story that came with it was too large, too strange, and too painful to share with people who cared only about appearances. Better to be thought clumsy than to explain the truth, and see pity replace curiosity in every face around her. But the Duke's words echoed in her mind long after Edmund had led her back into the crowd, long after the music had shifted to a new song, and the laughter over the spilled wine had faded into other, fresher gossip. "You would not remember me, but I remember you." What could he possibly mean by that? She had never set foot in Ambervale House before tonight. She had never been introduced to the Duke in any formal setting, had never even seen him from a distance until he arrived at this very feast an hour ago, greeting his guests with the same careful, measured politeness he seemed to offer everyone. And yet something in his voice, in the way he had looked at her, suggested a history she could not place, a memory she did not share, or perhaps one she had simply buried too deep to reach. The rest of the evening passed in the usual blur of introductions and dances, of careful conversation and careful smiles. Eleanor danced twice, both times with gentlemen chosen by her mother for their suitable fortunes and unremarkable personalities, and both times she felt the familiar tension in her leg as she counted her steps silently, praying she would not stumble again before the night was through. She did not see the Duke again until much later, as the guests began to gather their cloaks and call for their carriages. He stood near the entrance hall, bidding farewell to his departing guests with the same practiced grace he had shown all evening. When Eleanor's turn came to pass before him, he took her gloved hand for the briefest moment, the barest touch required by custom. "Miss Bright," he said, his voice pitched low again, meant only for her. "I hope you will forgive an old story that is not yet finished." Before she could ask what he meant, her mother's voice called from the carriage, and Eleanor had no choice but to step away, leaving the Duke's strange words hanging unanswered in the cold night air. As the carriage pulled away from Ambervale House, Eleanor looked back once through the small window and saw him still standing at the top of the steps, watching the departing guests with that same unreadable expression. For a moment, their eyes met across the growing distance, and something passed between them that she could not name, something heavy with unspoken history. She turned away from the window and pressed a hand against her leg, feeling the old, familiar ache beneath her skirts. 3 years had passed since the bridge, since the water, since the night that had changed the shape of her body and the course of her life forever. 3 years of silence, of hiding, of pretending the accident had never happened. And yet somehow, impossibly, the Duke of Ambervale seemed to know. The carriage rattled on through the dark London streets, carrying Eleanor home to a house full of questions she could not yet answer, and a memory that refused, after all this time, to stay buried. Beside her, Edmund watched the passing street lamps in silence, sensing that his sister's thoughts had drifted somewhere he could not follow. He did not ask what troubled her. He had learned over the years that Eleanor spoke when she was ready, and not a moment before. Instead, he reached over and gave her hand a light, steady squeeze, the kind of small comfort that needed no words at all. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the motion of the carriage rock her gently, but sleep would not come. Her mind kept circling back to the Duke's steady gaze, to the strange certainty in his voice when he said he remembered her. She had spent 3 years convincing herself that no one from that night on the bridge had ever truly seen her face, that the darkness and the chaos had hidden her well enough to keep her secret safe forever. Now, for the first time since the accident, she wondered if she had been wrong. The thought frightened her more than she wanted to admit, and yet beneath the fear, something else stirred as well, something she had not felt in a very long time, a flicker of hope that perhaps she would not have to carry this weight entirely alone. 3 years earlier, the rain had not stopped for 6 days. The river beneath Rivenbrook Bridge had risen higher than anyone in the village could remember, swollen and dark and furious, tearing branches and debris along its current with a speed that made even the boldest fishermen keep their distance. Eleanor had been 18 that year, visiting her aunt's cottage on the edge of the village while her parents traveled abroad, and she had woken that night to the sound of shouting in the streets below her window. The bridge was failing. It was the only crossing for miles, an old stone structure that had stood for generations, and on that particular night, a group of children returning from a late gathering at the church had been caught upon it, when the middle section began to crumble beneath the weight of the flood. Eleanor remembered running from her aunt's cottage in nothing but her nightgown and a borrowed coat, her bare feet slapping against wet cobblestones as she followed the crowd toward the riverbank. By the time she arrived, half the village had gathered, torches and lanterns casting shaking light across the churning water. 6 children were trapped on the collapsing bridge, clinging to the remaining stones as the current tore at the structure beneath them. Men shouted instructions to one another, but no one moved fast enough. No one seemed to know what to do. Eleanor did not remember deciding to act. She only remembered the moment she found herself wading into the freezing water, her nightgown heavy and dragging against her legs, her breath torn away by the cold shock of the current. Someone shouted her name behind her, one of the village men, but she did not stop. The bridge groaned above her, stones shifting and grinding as the water clawed at its foundation. She reached the first child, a small boy no older than 6, and pulled him against her chest, fighting the current with every ounce of strength she had. The journey back to shore felt endless, the water dragging at her limbs, but somehow she made it, handing the boy into the arms of a waiting villager before turning back for the next. It was on her 3rd crossing that everything changed. A young man had appeared at the edge of the crowd sometime during the chaos, though Eleanor had barely registered his presence in the panic of the moment. He was tall, dressed in fine clothes, utterly unsuited for wading into a flooded river, and yet he had thrown off his coat and entered the water without hesitation, working alongside the villagers to pull children from the collapsing structure. Eleanor did not know his name that night. She did not know he was the son of a duke, traveling through the region on his way back from a hunting trip with friends, or that he had stopped in the village only because his carriage wheel had broken that same afternoon. She knew only that he was strong, and steady, and unafraid, and that together they managed to pull 4 more children from the bridge before it finally gave way entirely, collapsing into the river with a sound like thunder. The last child, a girl of perhaps 10 years, had still been on the bridge when the final section crumbled. Eleanor moved without thinking, throwing herself forward through the water as the stones fell around her. She caught the girl's arm just as the current swept them both away from the wreckage, and for a terrible, endless moment, she believed they would both be lost beneath the water. Something struck her leg as they were pulled downstream, a falling stone or a piece of the shattered bridge, she never knew which. The pain was so sudden and so total that she nearly lost her grip on the girl entirely, but somehow her arms held firm even as her vision blurred with agony. She remembered the young stranger's hands closing around her other arm, remembered being dragged through the water toward the shore by his strength alone, remembered the girl coughing and crying against her chest as they finally reached solid ground. After that, everything blurred into fragments. Villagers wrapping her in blankets, someone shouting for a physician, the stranger's face above her, pale and streaked with rain, his eyes wide with something that might have been fear, or might have been awe. "You saved her," he had said, kneeling beside her in the mud. "You saved all of them." "We saved them," Eleanor had corrected, though her voice came out barely above a whisper, the pain in her leg so severe she could hardly form the words. Together. She did not remember much after that. The physician arrived within the hour and confirmed that her leg had been badly broken in 2 places, the bone shattered by whatever had struck her in the water. He said it as best he could, though he warned her aunt that the injury might never fully heal, that Eleanor might carry the damage with her for the rest of her life. He had been right. The bone healed, eventually, though not straight, and not without lasting consequence. Even now, 3 years later, there were moments when her leg simply failed her without warning, a sudden weakness or a flash of old pain that stole her balance entirely. The physicians in London had examined her more than once since the accident, offering various treatments and remedies, but none of them had been able to undo what the river had done that night. Eleanor had never told anyone in society the true story of her injury. Her parents, upon returning from their travels, had been horrified to learn what had happened, but they had also been quietly relieved that the story had not spread widely beyond the village where it occurred. A young unmarried woman wading into a flooded river in nothing but her nightgown was not the kind of story that helped a family's reputation, however brave the act had been. Better, her mother had decided, to let the matter fade quietly into the past, unmentioned and unremembered. And so Eleanor had learned to hide it. She had learned to laugh off her stumbles as clumsiness, to accept the whispered judgments of society, rather than explain the truth behind them. It was easier, in its way, than watching people's faces shift from mockery to uncomfortable pity, than answering endless questions about a night she still sometimes saw in her dreams, water rushing black and cold around her, the sound of stone breaking apart above her head. She had never learned the name of the young man who had helped her that night. He had vanished from the village before she was well enough to properly thank him. Called away by urgent business, or so her aunt had told her. She had wondered about him sometimes over the years, this stranger who had waded into a flood without hesitation, who had called her brave when the rest of the world would later call her clumsy. She had wondered if she would ever cross paths with him again, and had eventually decided that she would not, that he had simply been one more piece of that terrible night, gone as quickly as the bridge itself. She had been wrong about that too. Sitting now in her bedroom, long after the feast at Ambervale House had ended, Eleanor stared at the small, faded scar along her leg where the physician's careful work had left its mark, and turned the Duke's words over and over in her mind. "You would not remember me, but I remember you." Could it possibly be true? Could the young stranger from that terrible night, the man who had fought the current alongside her, who had pulled her from the water when her own strength finally failed, have grown into the very Duke who now stood at the center of London society, watching her across a crowded ballroom with such quiet, unreadable intensity? It seemed impossible, and yet nothing else explained the certainty in his voice, the strange weight behind his simple words. She thought of his hands, the way they had gripped her arm as he pulled her from the flood, strong and unwavering despite the chaos around them. She tried to picture that same young man's face grown older, sharper, more composed, and found that she could not quite separate the memory from the man she had met tonight. Perhaps it had been there all along, some familiar echo she had not recognized until his words gave her permission to look for it. Sleep did not come easily that night. Eleanor lay awake long after the candles had burned low, staring at the ceiling above her bed, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling around her. Somewhere across London, in a grand house she had visited only once, the Duke of Ambervale was likely doing the same, carrying his own version of that night 3 years ago, his own memories of stone and water, and a girl who had refused to let a single child drown, while the world watched in helpless panic. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find a way to see him again. She would ask him directly, without pretense or careful maneuvering, whether her suspicion was true. She owed the stranger from that night a proper thank you, one she had never been able to give. And if that stranger truly was the Duke of Ambervale, then perhaps the strange, unexplainable connection she had felt in his presence tonight was not so strange after all. Perhaps it had been there from the very beginning, buried beneath years of silence, waiting patiently for the right moment to surface. Outside her window, the London night stretched on, quiet and cold, carrying with it the promise of a truth that had waited 3 long years to be spoken aloud. She rose from her bed and crossed to the window, pulling the curtain aside to look out over the sleeping street below. The lamplighters had long since finished their rounds, and only a scattering of golden lights remained, flickering against the darkness like small, stubborn stars. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and let her mind drift back to those first days after the accident, when she had lain in her aunt's small cottage, her leg bound tightly and propped upon a pillow, unable to do more than watch the rain continue to fall outside her window. Her aunt, a kind but practical woman named Margaret, had nursed her through those difficult weeks with a patience Eleanor had never fully thanked her for. She remembered the endless days of boredom and pain, the physician's grim visits, the slow, agonizing process of learning to walk again, once the worst of the swelling had finally gone down. She remembered, too, the quiet nights when her aunt would sit beside her bed and speak of ordinary things, the garden, the village gossip, anything to keep Eleanor's mind away from the ache in her leg and the darker memories of that terrible night. It was during one of those nights that Eleanor had first asked about the young stranger who had helped her in the water. "No one seems to know his name," her aunt had said. frowning as she folded a length of linen for fresh bandages. The innkeeper says a young gentleman's carriage broke down on the road that same afternoon, and that he stayed only long enough to see the worst of the flood pass before continuing on his journey. A quiet sort, by all accounts, kept to himself. Did no one think to ask his name before he left? I imagine everyone was rather occupied that night, my dear, her aunt had replied gently, and Eleanor had not been able to argue with that. She had spent the following weeks imagining what had become of him, picturing a dozen different lives he might have returned to, once his carriage was repaired and his journey resumed. A merchant's son, perhaps, or a soldier passing through on leave. She had never once imagined a duke, and certainly never imagined that their paths might cross again 3 years later in the grand hall of his own family estate. The memory of his hands remained the clearest part of that night for her, clearer even than the pain of her broken leg or the terror of the collapsing bridge. They had been steady in a way that nothing else around her had been that night, strong and certain even as the current threatened to pull them both under. She remembered the brief moment after they reached the shore, when he had knelt beside her in the mud and looked at her with something like wonder in his rain-streaked face, as though he could not quite believe what they had accomplished together. You saved her. You saved all of them. She had corrected him then, insisted that the rescue had been shared between them, that neither of them could have managed it alone. She wondered now whether he remembered that exchange as clearly as she did, whether it had stayed with him through the years the way it had stayed with her, a small, private truth buried beneath the weight of everything that came after. Eleanor let the curtain fall back into place and returned to her bed, though sleep still refused to come easily. She thought of the ballroom that evening, of Lady Caroline's cutting laughter and the crowd's easy cruelty, and found herself wondering, for the first time in 3 years, whether the Duke had watched those moments with something more than simple curiosity. Had he recognized her the instant she stumbled, the same unsteady weakness in her leg that had first appeared on the night of the flood? Had he spent the entire feast waiting for the right moment to approach her, weighing his words carefully before finally speaking them at the window? The thought filled her with a strange mixture of comfort and unease. Comfort, because for the first time in years, someone else in the world might understand the true weight of what she carried. Unease, because that same understanding meant someone else now held a piece of her secret, a secret she had guarded so carefully for so long that she barely remembered how to speak of it openly. She thought, too, of her mother's reaction when the truth of the accident had first reached her ears, the horror not at Eleanor's injury but at the scandal such a story might create if it ever spread beyond the village. Her mother had spent weeks afterward carefully steering conversations away from the subject, discouraging Eleanor from mentioning the bridge to anyone outside the family, insisting that society would never understand a young woman's choice to wade into a flooded river, however noble the cause. Eleanor had accepted her mother's caution at the time, too exhausted and too young to argue the point, but lying awake now, 3 years later, she found herself questioning that old decision for the first time. What if the truth, spoken aloud, brought not scandal, but something closer to respect? What if the Duke's willingness to acknowledge what had happened between them was the first step toward finally setting down a burden she had carried alone for far too long? It was a fragile hope, she knew, easily broken by the realities of society and reputation that governed every corner of her life. But as the candle beside her bed finally burned down to nothing, and darkness settled fully over the room, Eleanor allowed herself, just this once, to hold on to it. Tomorrow, she told herself again, drifting finally toward sleep. Tomorrow she would find a way to speak with him properly, away from the crowds and the whispers, and learn once and for all whether the man who now called himself the Duke of Ambervale was truly the same stranger who had once pulled her from a flooded river and called her brave. A letter arrived 3 days after the feast, sealed with the crest of Ambervale House. Eleanor's mother nearly dropped her teacup when the footman presented it, her eyes widening as she recognized the wax seal pressed into the paper. "The Duke has written to you directly?" she asked, her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and delight. "Eleanor, this is extraordinary. Dukes do not simply write letters to young women they have only just met." Eleanor took the letter with hands that were not quite steady, aware of her mother watching her every movement with sharp, hopeful attention. She excused herself to the privacy of her room before breaking the seal, unwilling to let her mother witness whatever reaction the letter might draw from her. The words inside were brief, formal enough to satisfy any watching eye, yet carrying an unmistakable weight beneath their careful phrasing. "Miss Bright, I find myself in need of your opinion regarding a matter of some importance to my family's history. If you are amenable, I would be honored if you and your mother would join me for tea at Ambervale House this coming Thursday. There is a particular room in the house I believe you may find of interest. Yours in respect, Ambervale. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before setting it down upon her desk. A particular room. She could not imagine what he meant, though something in the careful phrasing suggested he was choosing his words with great deliberation, aware that the letter might be read by eyes other than her own before it ever reached her hands. She composed her reply that same afternoon, accepting the invitation on behalf of herself and her mother, and spent the following days in a state of restless anticipation that she did her best to hide from her family. Edmund noticed anyway, of course. He always did. "You have barely touched your dinner," he observed on Wednesday evening, watching her push a piece of roasted chicken around her plate without any real interest in eating it. "Is something troubling you, or are you simply nervous about tea with a duke?" "I am not nervous," Eleanor said, though the words came out less convincing than she intended. Edmund raised an eyebrow but said nothing further, and Eleanor was grateful for his restraint. She had not yet told him about the bridge, about the strange possibility that had taken root in her mind since the feast. Some part of her wanted to be certain first, to have real proof before she spoke the theory aloud and risked being told it was nothing more than foolish wishful thinking. Thursday arrived gray and overcast, the London sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered it. Eleanor dressed carefully, choosing a pale blue gown that her mother had insisted was flattering without being too bold, and spent the carriage ride to Ambervale House in near total silence, her mind turning over every possible explanation for the Duke's invitation. Ambervale House looked different in the daylight than it had during the feast, less grand and imposing, more simply beautiful, its stone facade softened by the gray afternoon light. A footman greeted them at the entrance and led them through a series of elegant corridors, past portraits of solemn ancestors and tall windows overlooking manicured gardens, until they reached a small, comfortable sitting room where the Duke himself waited to receive them. He rose as they entered, offering a formal bow to Eleanor's mother, before turning his attention to Eleanor with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that same quiet, careful watchfulness she had noticed at the feast. "Miss Bright, Mrs. Bright, thank you both for accepting my invitation." Tea was poured, pleasantries exchanged, and for nearly half an hour the conversation remained carefully ordinary, touching on the weather, the upcoming season's events, and the health of various mutual acquaintances. Eleanor's mother seemed thoroughly delighted by the entire affair, clearly already imagining the possibilities such an invitation might represent for her daughter's prospects. It was only when the tea things had been cleared away that the Duke rose and gestured toward the door. "Miss Bright, there is something I would like to show you, if your mother does not object. It concerns a matter of family history I mentioned in my letter." Eleanor's mother, sensing an opportunity she did not wish to disturb, waved a hand with barely concealed enthusiasm. "Of course, Your Grace. Please. Do not let me interfere." The Duke led Eleanor down a long corridor lined with portraits, past a grand staircase and through a set of heavy wooden doors into what appeared to be a private study, smaller and less formal than the rooms they had passed through before. A fire burned low in the hearth, and the walls were lined with books and framed maps, the kind of room that belonged to a man who valued quiet contemplation over public display. He closed the door behind them, leaving them alone for the first time since the feast, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken with something that was not quite fear, and not quite excitement, but some uncertain place between the two. "I owe you an explanation," he said, without preamble, moving toward the fireplace and standing with his back partially turned toward her, as though the words came easier when he did not have to watch her face while speaking them, "for my words at the feast. I have thought of little else since that evening, and I find I can no longer keep the truth to myself, whatever consequences may follow. Your Grace. 3 years ago," he continued, cutting gently through her attempt to speak, "I was traveling north with a group of friends when my carriage wheel broke on the road near a small village called Rivenbrook. We were forced to stop for repairs, and I found myself with an unexpected evening to spare in a town I had never before visited, and have not visited since." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She said nothing, unable to trust her voice, and waited for him to continue. "That same evening, the rains that had plagued the region for nearly a week finally broke the old stone bridge at the edge of the village. Children were trapped upon it as the structure began to fail." He turned now to face her fully, his dark eyes steady and unflinching. "I remember very little of that night with any real clarity. The chaos, the cold, the sound of stone breaking apart beneath the water. But I remember one thing with absolute certainty, a memory that has never once faded in 3 years, however much I might have wished it would." He paused, and Eleanor felt the room grow impossibly still around them. "I remember a young woman in a soaked nightgown, wading into that flood without hesitation, pulling children from the wreckage one by one, while grown men stood frozen upon the shore. I remember her strength, her steadiness, the way she refused to stop even as the current grew stronger, and the danger grew worse. And I remember the moment the final section of the bridge collapsed, and she threw herself forward to catch the last child before the stones could take her too. Eleanor's hands had begun to tremble, though she was not entirely certain whether it was from fear or relief or something else entirely, some emotion too large and too complicated to name. I remember pulling both of you from the water, the Duke continued, his voice growing quieter, more careful, as though he were navigating ground he knew to be fragile. I remember your leg, the way you cried out when we finally reached the shore, though you tried so hard to hide the sound. And I remember the words you spoke to me, when I told you that you had saved that little girl's life. We saved them together, Eleanor whispered, the memory rising unbidden to her lips. The same words she had spoken that night 3 years ago, cold and shaking and bleeding in the mud beside a stranger she had never properly thanked. Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a flicker of emotion breaking through his careful composure. Yes, he said softly, that is exactly what you said. The silence that followed felt enormous, filled with 3 years of unspoken history finally given voice between them. Eleanor pressed a hand against her chest, trying to steady her breathing, trying to make sense of the impossible truth now standing before her in the shape of a Duke she had met only days ago at a crowded feast. It was you, she said finally, the words barely more than a breath. All this time, and I never knew your name. I looked for you afterward, when I was well enough to ask. No one could tell me who you were. I left before I could learn your name either, he admitted. My friends were anxious to continue our journey, and I did not think to ask before we departed. I have regretted that decision every day since, more than I can properly express. You recognized me at the feast. The moment you stumbled, he confirmed. I knew instantly, though I told myself it was impossible, that I must be mistaken. But then I saw your face clearly, and there was no more room for doubt. You looked exactly as you had that night, 3 years older, but unmistakably the same woman who had waded into a flooded river without a single moment's hesitation. Eleanor moved toward the window, needing distance, needing air, though the room suddenly felt too small to contain everything that had just been spoken within it. Do you know what it has cost me, these past 3 years? To smile and apologize every time my leg fails me in front of a room full of strangers. To let them believe I am simply careless, simply clumsy, rather than explain a truth no one in society would ever understand or respect? I imagine it has cost you a great deal, he said gently, moving to stand beside her, though he was careful to keep a respectful distance between them. And I am sorry that my silence at the feast added even a moment more to that burden. I should have spoken plainly the instant I recognized you, rather than leaving you to wonder and worry for days afterward. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful deliberation he seemed to bring to everything. Because I did not know how you would wish the truth to be told, or whether you wished it told at all. I did not want to take that choice away from you by speaking too soon, too publicly, before I understood what you needed. Eleanor turned to study his face, searching for any trace of the careless cruelty she had come to expect from society's most celebrated men, and found none. Only quiet sincerity, and something else beneath it, something that looked remarkably like the same fragile hope she had carried with her since the night of the feast. Thank you, she said finally, for remembering, for carrying the truth of that night as carefully as I have. I could not forget it if I tried, he replied. I have thought of that bridge more often than you might imagine, over these 3 years. I have wondered what became of the brave young woman who waded into a flood without a second's hesitation, and I confess I never expected to find her standing in my own ballroom, hiding an old injury behind careful smiles and quiet apologies. Outside, the gray afternoon had begun to darken toward evening, and somewhere beyond the study door, Eleanor's mother was surely growing curious about the length of their private conversation. But for this one suspended moment, none of that seemed to matter. There was only the fire crackling softly in the hearth, and the weight of a shared history finally spoken aloud after 3 long years of silence, and the strange, fragile beginning of something neither of them yet had the words to properly name. May I ask you something else? Eleanor said after a while, when the silence had grown comfortable enough to break without disturbing whatever fragile understanding had settled between them. Of course. Why did you never speak of that night to anyone? Surely a duke's presence at such an event would have been remembered by someone in the village. Why did no story ever reach London? The duke's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile, tired and a little rueful. My father was still alive then, and very much concerned with how his family's name appeared in society. He believed a story of his son wading into a flooded river, risking injury or worse for strangers in a village we had never before visited, would be seen as reckless rather than admirable. He instructed me never to speak of it, and I confess I was young enough and dutiful enough to obey him without much argument. That seems a strange thing to be ashamed of. I agree with you now, he said. I did not always. It took losing my father, and inheriting the full weight of this house and everything within it, to understand how much of my life I had spent shaping myself around his expectations rather than my own convictions. I regret many things about those years, Miss Bright, but perhaps none more than my silence about that night. You deserved better than a stranger who vanished without a word. Eleanor considered this, turning the confession over in her mind. It was not so different, she realized, from her own mother's insistence on hiding the truth of the bridge, on smoothing over anything that might be seen as unusual or scandalous in the eyes of society. Perhaps that was simply the nature of the world they both lived in, a world that valued appearances above almost everything else, even courage, even truth. My mother did much the same, she admitted. She was horrified when she learned what had happened, not because I had been injured, but because of what people might say if the story spread. She has spent 3 years quietly discouraging me from ever mentioning it, convincing me it was better forgotten entirely. And do you agree with her, that it is better forgotten? Eleanor thought carefully before answering, aware that her response carried more weight than a simple yes or no. I did, for a long time. It was easier to let people believe I was clumsy than to explain a truth that felt too large and too strange for polite conversation. But sitting here now, hearing you speak of that night as clearly as I remember it myself, I find I am no longer certain I wish to keep hiding it. Something shifted again in the Duke's expression, a warmth entering his dark eyes that had not been there before. I am glad to hear you say that, though I understand if the idea still frightens you. Society is not always kind to those who step outside its expectations, however noble the reason. No, Eleanor agreed softly, it is not. A knock sounded at the study door before either of them could say more, and a moment later a footman appeared to inform them that Mrs. Bright had begun to wonder whether the hour had grown too late for propriety. The Duke nodded, his expression smoothing back into the careful, formal mask Eleanor had first seen him wear at the feast, though something in his eyes remained softer than before, a private warmth that lingered even as the outside world intruded once more upon their conversation. I do not wish to keep you longer than is proper, he said, offering his arm as they made their way back toward the sitting room where Eleanor's mother waited. But I hope, Miss Bright, that this will not be the last conversation of its kind between us. I hope so too, Your Grace, Eleanor replied, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it entirely. Her mother greeted their return with barely restrained curiosity, her eyes darting between Eleanor's face and the Duke's, searching for some clue as to what had passed between them during their absence. But Eleanor offered only a small, private smile, unwilling to share the fullness of what had just occurred, not yet ready to expose something so new and so fragile to the sharp eyes of society, even within the privacy of her own family. The carriage ride home was quiet, Eleanor's thoughts too full and too tangled to easily put into words. Her mother, sensing the change in her daughter's mood, chose for once not to press with questions, though the hopeful look in her eyes suggested she had already begun imagining a future far grander than anything Eleanor herself dared to picture yet. As the carriage rattled through the darkening streets of London, Eleanor pressed a hand against the old, familiar ache in her leg, and for the first time in 3 years, the pain felt less like a secret burden and more like proof of something she had once been brave enough to do. Somewhere behind her, in the grand study of Ambervale House, a Duke sat alone by his fire, turning over the same memories, the same fragile hope, and wondering, just as she was, what might come next between two people bound together by a night neither of them could ever fully forget. Lord Peter Ashford called upon Eleanor's family the very next week, arriving with a bouquet of hothouse flowers and a confidence that suggested he had never once considered the possibility of rejection. Miss Bright, he said, bowing over her hand with practiced grace, I hope you will forgive my boldness in calling so soon after our last meeting. I find I have thought of little else since the assembly. Eleanor offered a polite smile, though her mind remained elsewhere, still turning over the conversation she had shared with the Duke in his private study only days before. Lord Ashford was, by every reasonable measure, an excellent match. He possessed a comfortable fortune, a respectable family name, and manners that pleased everyone he encountered. Eleanor's mother had made her opinion on the matter abundantly clear over the past several days, dropping hints about his character with all the subtlety of a falling brick. He would make a fine husband, Eleanor, her mother had said just that morning, watching from the window as his carriage approached. Steady, respectable, and patient with your particular difficulties. You could do far worse. Your particular difficulties. Eleanor had turned the phrase over bitterly in her mind long after her mother left the room. It was, she supposed, meant kindly, in the strange, backward way her mother often intended her comments. But it stung nonetheless, this constant framing of her injury as a flaw to be managed, a problem requiring a patient husband's forbearance, rather than a truth deserving of respect. Lord Ashford, seated now across from her in the drawing room, seemed entirely unaware of the tension simmering beneath Eleanor's polite expression. He spoke at length about his estate in Kent, his recent improvements to the gardens, his plans for the coming hunting season, pausing occasionally to ask Eleanor a question that required little more than a nod or brief agreement in response. "You must forgive me if I stumble over my words," he said at one point, with a small, indulgent laugh, "though I imagine you understand better than most the trouble of a body that does not always cooperate with one's intentions." Eleanor felt her spine stiffen. "I beg your pardon?" "Your leg, Miss Bright. I have heard of your unfortunate tendency toward clumsiness. I assure you, it does not trouble me in the slightest. A wife's small imperfections are easily overlooked when she brings other virtues to a marriage." The words settled over Eleanor like a weight, cold and unwelcome, confirming everything she had feared about how the world perceived her injury. She thought of the Duke's study, of his steady voice recounting the truth of that night on the bridge, of the respect and quiet admiration that had colored every word he spoke about her courage. The contrast between the two conversations felt suddenly, painfully stark. "My leg," she said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate precision, "is not an imperfection to be overlooked, Lord Ashford. It is the result of an injury I sustained while saving the lives of 6 children from a collapsing bridge. I would ask that you not speak of it as though it were some flaw in my character." Lord Ashford blinked, clearly caught off guard by the sharpness in her voice. "I meant no offense, Miss Bright. I only wish to reassure you that such things need not stand in the way of a happy marriage." "I understand your intention," Eleanor replied, softening only slightly, "but I would ask that you understand mine as well." The conversation limped along for a while longer, before Lord Ashford took his leave, his easy confidence somewhat dented by the exchange, though not entirely extinguished. Eleanor's mother appeared moments after his departure, her expression a careful mixture of concern and disappointment. "Eleanor, what happened?" He seemed rather subdued when he left. "He called my injury an imperfection, Mother. I simply corrected him." Her mother sighed, settling into the chair Lord Ashford had recently vacated. "Eleanor, I understand your pride in the matter. Truly I do. But you must consider your prospects carefully. Lord Ashford is a good man, and not every suitor will be so understanding of your circumstances. You cannot afford to turn away every gentleman who speaks carelessly. Perhaps I do not wish to marry a man who requires understanding of my circumstances, Mother. Perhaps I wish to marry a man who sees my circumstances as something other than a burden to be tolerated." Her mother's expression grew troubled, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she might argue further. Instead, her mother simply studied her for a long moment, something like realization dawning slowly across her features. "This is about the Duke, isn't it? Whatever passed between you during your visit to Ambervale House?" Eleanor said nothing, though her silence was answer enough. "Eleanor, be careful," her mother said, her voice softening into something closer to genuine worry. "A duke's attention is a powerful thing, but it is not the same as a duke's intention. Do not allow yourself to hope for more than what is actually being offered, however kind his words may have seemed." The warning lingered with Eleanor for the rest of the day, a quiet counterpoint to the cautious hope that had been building within her since her visit to Ambervale House. Her mother was not wrong to worry. Dukes did not typically marry the daughters of modest gentry families, however brave their history together might be. Society had rules about such things, rules that rarely bent for anyone, regardless of circumstance. And yet, when a second letter arrived from Ambervale House 3 days later, inviting her to walk in the gardens should the weather permit, Eleanor found she could not bring herself to decline, whatever caution her mother's warning had planted in her mind. The gardens at Ambervale House stretched wide and green behind the main house, carefully tended paths winding between hedges and flower beds that had clearly been the work of generations of careful gardeners. Eleanor walked beside the Duke at a measured pace, grateful that he seemed to instinctively understand her need for steady, even ground, adjusting his stride without comment or fuss whenever the path grew uneven. "Your mother did not accompany you today," he observed, glancing sideways at her as they walked. "She had a prior engagement. Eleanor said, though the truth was closer to her mother's cautious reluctance to encourage what she still viewed as an uncertain and possibly dangerous hope. She sends her regards. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, past a small fountain and a stretch of rose bushes just beginning to bloom, before the Duke spoke again, his voice carrying a note of careful hesitation Eleanor had not heard from him before. "I understand Lord Ashford has been calling on you." Eleanor glanced up, surprised. "You have heard of that?" "London society moves quickly with its gossip, Miss Bright, particularly where marriageable young ladies are concerned." A faint, wry smile touched his mouth, though something more serious lingered beneath it. "May I ask how the visit went?" Eleanor considered deflecting the question, retreating into polite vagueness the way she had learned to do with most of society, but something about the Duke's steady, unhurried patience made her want to answer honestly instead. "He called my leg an imperfection," she said simply. "One he assured me he was willing to overlook." The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though his voice remained carefully controlled. That was unkind of him. He did not intend unkindness. He simply saw what everyone else sees, a flaw to be managed, rather than a story worth understanding. "And what do you see when you look at your own leg, Miss Bright?" The question caught her off guard, unexpected in its directness. She paused beside the fountain, watching the water catch the pale afternoon light, and considered her answer carefully before speaking. "I used to see only the pain of it," she admitted. "The way it marked me as different, as clumsy, as something less than whole in the eyes of everyone around me. But lately, I find I am beginning to see something else instead. Proof, perhaps, that I once did something brave enough to matter, however much it cost me afterward." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his dark eyes. "I think that is exactly what it is," he said quietly. "Proof of courage, not a flaw to be overlooked or managed. I only wish more of society could see it as clearly as I do." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm under the weight of his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the garden around them growing quiet except for the gentle sound of the fountain and the distant call of birds settling into the hedges for the evening. She thought of her mother's warning, of the vast difference between a duke's attention and a duke's intention, and wondered, standing there in the fading afternoon light, whether this quiet, careful man beside her might prove to be the exception to every rule society had ever taught her to expect. They continued along the path, past a row of tall hedges trimmed into careful shapes, and the Duke seemed content to let the silence stretch comfortably between them for a while before speaking again. "May I tell you something I have never told another living soul?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant in a way that seemed at odds with his usual composure. "Of course. After that night on the bridge, I found myself unable to settle back into my old life. I had spent years believing my purpose was simply to inherit my father's estate, manage his affairs, and marry well when the time came. But after Rivenbrook, none of that seemed to matter in quite the same way. I kept thinking of you, wading into that flood without a moment's hesitation, and wondering what it must feel like to care so entirely about strangers that you would risk everything for them." Eleanor listened, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice, so different from the careful, measured tone he had used at the feast. "I began spending more time among my tenants after that," he continued, "listening to their concerns, involving myself in matters I once would have left entirely to stewards and managers. My father did not approve. He believed a duke's business was policy and prestige, not the daily troubles of farmers and shopkeepers. But I found I could not return to seeing the world the way I once had, not after watching you throw yourself into danger for children you had never even met. I did not do it for glory, Your Grace. I hardly thought at all in that moment. I simply acted." "I know," he said. "That is precisely what has stayed with me. Not the drama of the night itself, but the simplicity of your courage. You did not hesitate to weigh the cost before acting. You simply saw what needed doing, and you did it." They had reached the far end of the garden now, where a low stone wall marked the boundary between the cultivated grounds and the wilder parkland beyond. Eleanor rested her hand against the cool stone, grateful for its steadiness beneath her palm. "My mother believes I should be grateful for any man willing to overlook my injury," she said softly. "She does not understand why that thought troubles me so deeply." "I think I understand," the Duke said. "To be overlooked is not the same as to be seen. Lord Ashford and men like him will always view your leg as something requiring patience or forgiveness. But you do not need forgiveness for an act of courage, Miss Bright. You deserve to be known for what you truly are, not merely tolerated for what society mistakenly believes you to be." Eleanor turned to face him fully, searching his expression for any trace of practiced flattery, any hint that his words were simply the polished performance of a man skilled in charming young women. She found none, only quiet sincerity, steady and unwavering, the same quality she remembered from the night he had pulled her from the flooded river 3 years ago. "Why does it matter so much to you," she asked carefully, "how I am seen by the rest of society?" The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the darkening horizon beyond the garden wall, before returning to meet hers directly. "Because I have spent 3 years unable to forget you, Miss Bright. Because watching you endure that ballroom's cruelty while carrying a secret of such quiet heroism struck me as one of the great injustices I have witnessed in my life. And because, if I am entirely honest, I find that my regard for you has grown into something far beyond simple gratitude or admiration." Eleanor's breath caught, her heart beating unsteadily beneath her ribs. She had not expected such directness, had not allowed herself to hope for words so plainly spoken. "Your Grace, I do not say this to press you toward any decision you are not ready to make," he added quickly, a flush of color rising along his jaw, the first crack Eleanor had seen in his careful composure. "Only to be honest with you, as you have been honest with me. Whatever comes next, I did not wish you to wonder about my intentions the way your mother clearly fears you might." The evening light had softened into deep gold around them, casting long shadows across the garden path, and Eleanor found herself smiling despite the whirlwind of emotion tightening in her chest. "Thank you for your honesty, Your Grace. I confess I did not expect it, though I find I am glad of it all the same." "Alistair," he said quietly, "if we are to be honest with one another, I would rather you use my name." "Alistair," she repeated, testing the sound of it, and found that it settled easily upon her tongue, as though it had always belonged there. "Then you must call me Eleanor." They walked back toward the house as the last light faded from the sky, neither of them speaking much further, though the silence between them now carried none of the earlier caution. It felt instead like the comfortable quiet of two people who had finally stopped guarding themselves against a truth they had both been circling for far too long. Lady Caroline Hunt had never taken well to being ignored. She had watched with growing irritation as the Duke of Ambervale's attention shifted steadily over the past fortnight, away from herself and toward the quiet, unremarkable Miss Bright, a woman Caroline had considered beneath serious notice since the very first evening she stumbled over her own feet at the feast. Caroline had spent 2 seasons carefully cultivating the Duke's favor, attending every event he might possibly attend, positioning herself at his side whenever opportunity allowed, and she had no intention of watching those efforts collapse because of some clumsy nobody with an unfortunate limp. So when her maid returned from an errand in the village with an interesting piece of gossip, gathered from a chatty coachman who claimed to have driven a physician to the Bright residence some years prior, Caroline listened with great interest. "A broken leg, my lady, from some accident near a village called Rivenbrook. The coachman said there was talk at the time of a flood, and children saved from a bridge, though the family kept the details rather quiet." Caroline turned the information over carefully in her mind, considering its usefulness. A story of childish heroism seemed, on its surface, rather unhelpful to her purposes, likely to earn Miss Bright's sympathy rather than scorn. But Caroline was skilled at finding the angle in any story that served her best, and she began, that very evening, to reshape the tale into something far less flattering. By the following week, a new version of events had begun circulating through London's drawing rooms, whispered behind fans and exchanged over afternoon tea. In this version, Miss Bright had not bravely saved drowning children, but had recklessly wandered into a dangerous flood against every sensible warning, nearly drowning herself and requiring rescue by others who had been forced to risk their own safety on her account. Some versions of the story suggested she had been running from an unwanted engagement in her aunt's village, using the flood as an excuse to disappear from an arrangement her family had found embarrassing. Other versions hinted at scandal entirely unrelated to any bridge at all, planting seeds of doubt that grew wilder with each retelling. Eleanor first heard the whispers at a garden party hosted by one of her mother's acquaintances, catching fragments of conversation that stopped abruptly whenever she drew near. She noticed the sideways glances, the sudden silences, the way certain ladies who had previously been friendly now seemed to find urgent business elsewhere whenever she approached. "What is happening?" she asked her mother quietly, once they had found a private corner away from the worst of the crowd. Her mother's face had gone pale, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "There is a story circulating, Eleanor, about the accident, about Rivenbrook. I do not know how the details reached London, but they have twisted everything, made it sound as though you behaved recklessly, or worse, that there was some scandal behind your presence in that village at all." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her. 3 years of careful silence unraveling in a single afternoon through no fault or choice of her own. Who would spread such a thing? Her mother's eyes flickered briefly toward the far side of the garden, where Lady Caroline stood, surrounded by her usual circle of admirers, watching Eleanor with an expression of poorly concealed satisfaction. Eleanor did not need her mother to speak the name aloud. She understood immediately. Edmund found her later that same evening, sitting alone in the small parlor at the back of the house, staring at nothing in particular while the sounds of the household settled around her. He had heard the rumors too, of course. Everyone had heard by now. "I could challenge someone if you like," he said, settling into the chair across from her with an attempt at lightness that did not quite mask the anger simmering beneath his words. "Lady Caroline does not strike me as the dueling sort, but perhaps I could find a suitable brother or cousin to stand in her place." Despite everything, Eleanor found herself smiling faintly. "I do not think violence is quite the answer here, Edmund, however satisfying the thought might be." "Then what is the answer? Because I confess I do not know how to watch you endure this without doing something about it." His humor faded entirely now, replaced by genuine concern. "You have carried this secret alone for 3 years, Eleanor. I have watched you smile through every cruel comment, every whispered judgment, and said nothing because you asked me not to. But this is different. This is not simply cruelty over a stumble at a dance. This is an attack on your character, on your honesty, and I cannot simply sit by and watch it happen without wanting to do something." Eleanor reached across the small space between them and took her brother's hand, grateful beyond words for his steady loyalty through everything. "I know, Edmund, and I promise you, I do not intend to sit by either. But I think the only real answer is the truth, spoken plainly and publicly, not hidden away any longer out of fear of what people might think. Are you certain you are ready for that? Once it is said, it cannot be unsaid. People will ask questions. They will want details. Some will still doubt you, whatever the truth actually is." "I know," Eleanor said again, quieter this time. "But I am more tired of hiding than I am afraid of being doubted. I would rather face whatever comes from speaking honestly than continue watching lies grow larger every day I remain silent." Edmund studied her for a long moment, something like pride slowly replacing the anger in his expression. "You have always been the braver of the two of us, you know. Even before the bridge, I used to envy it, when we were children, your certainty about things, your willingness to act while I was still busy weighing every possible consequence. I do not feel very brave most days," Eleanor admitted. "Most days I feel simply tired, and a little frightened, and uncertain whether any of this will end well." "That sounds rather like the definition of bravery to me," Edmund said gently. "Doing the difficult thing despite the fear, not because the fear is absent entirely." The following days brought a steady erosion of the careful goodwill Eleanor had spent the season building. Invitations that had once arrived regularly grew sparse. Conversations at the events she did attend turned pointed and probing, ladies asking careful questions designed to draw out details they could later twist further. Lord Ashford, who had continued his polite if unenthusiastic courtship despite their earlier disagreement, ceased calling entirely, his family apparently deciding that whatever scandal now surrounded Miss Bright's name was not worth the risk to their own reputation. Eleanor bore it as best she could, drawing on the same quiet composure that had carried her through years of mockery over her clumsiness. But this felt different, sharper somehow, because this time the whispers touched not just her physical grace but her character entirely, painting her as something reckless and possibly dishonest, rather than merely unfortunate. She had not seen Alistair in nearly a week when his letter finally arrived, shorter and more urgent than his previous correspondence. "Eleanor, I have heard the stories now spreading through London, and I understand you may be reluctant to appear publicly while such rumors persist. I ask that you trust me a little longer. There is a ball at Ambervale House this Saturday, already long planned and impossible to cancel without drawing further attention. I would consider it a great honor if you would attend as my guest. Whatever comes of that evening, I promise you will not face it alone. Alistair." Eleanor read the letter several times, torn between fear of further public humiliation and a growing certainty that hiding from the rumors would only allow them to grow stronger in her absence. Her mother, when shown the letter, expressed immediate and vocal reservation. "Eleanor, attending that ball while these rumors circulate could be disastrous. If the Duke intends to make some public statement and it goes poorly, you could be ruined entirely, far beyond anything Lady Caroline's whispers have already accomplished." "And if I do not attend," Eleanor countered, "the rumors will simply continue unchallenged, and I will spend the rest of my life hiding from a truth I have no reason to be ashamed of. Mother, I am tired of hiding. I have been hiding for 3 years, and look what it has cost me. Silence did not protect me from Lady Caroline's lies. Perhaps only the truth can do that now. So, her mother studied her for a long moment, something shifting in her expression, some old resistance finally giving way beneath the weight of Eleanor's certainty. You have grown very brave, Eleanor, these past weeks. I did not grow brave, Mother. I have always been brave. I simply stopped letting others convince me otherwise. The ball arrived on a clear evening, the kind of soft summer night that seemed entirely unsuited to the tension coiled tight in Eleanor's chest as her carriage approached Ambervale House. She had chosen her gown carefully, a deep green silk that her mother insisted brought out the color of her eyes, and had spent the ride reciting the truth of that night at Rivenbrook to herself, over and over, until the words felt steady and certain rather than fragile. The hall was already crowded when she arrived, candlelight glittering across a sea of silk and jewels, and Eleanor felt every eye turn toward her the moment she crossed the threshold, exactly as they had at the first feast weeks ago. But this time, she did not shrink from the attention. She lifted her chin and walked forward with steady, deliberate steps, ignoring the whispers that followed her progress across the room. She noticed the way conversations paused as she passed, the way fans lifted to cover murmured comments, the way certain ladies who had once greeted her warmly now offered only stiff, uncertain nods before turning quickly away. It would have been easy, in another lifetime, to let the weight of all that judgment press her back toward the doors, back into the safety of retreat. But Eleanor had made a promise to herself in the carriage, and she intended to keep it, whatever the cost. Her mother walked close beside her, her own composure clearly costing considerable effort, though she said nothing to discourage Eleanor's steady progress across the hall. Edmund had come as well, positioning himself a few steps behind, close enough to offer support without crowding her, exactly as he always did. Alistair found her within minutes, his relief at her arrival evident in the brief, warm press of his hand against hers before propriety demanded he release it. You came. You asked me to trust you, Eleanor said quietly. I intend to. Lady Caroline appeared not long after, drifting toward them with the deliberate grace of a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of public confrontation, disguised as casual conversation. Miss Bright, she said, her voice carrying just far enough for the surrounding guests to hear clearly. How brave of you to show your face tonight, given everything currently being said about you. The surrounding conversation quieted, guests turning with barely concealed curiosity to watch the exchange unfold. Eleanor felt her heart pounding, but she kept her voice steady, refusing to let the old instinct toward silence and retreat win out against the resolve she had spent the past week building. I am not entirely certain what is being said, Lady Caroline, since so much of it seems to shift, depending on who is telling the story. Perhaps you would care to clarify which version you would like me to address. A ripple of surprise moved through the nearby crowd, unaccustomed to seeing Miss Bright respond with anything other than quiet, apologetic retreat. Lady Caroline's smile faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly. I have simply heard that your family's story about some heroic rescue does not entirely match the facts, Miss Bright, that perhaps there was rather more scandal to the matter than heroism. Then allow me to correct the record entirely, Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly now across the hushed hall, since it seems the truth has been buried beneath quite a lot of careless gossip. Lady Caroline's eyes narrowed slightly, though she maintained her pleasant expression for the benefit of the watching crowd. By all means, Miss Bright, I am certain everyone here would be fascinated to hear your version of events. 3 years ago, Eleanor began, her voice steadier than she had expected it to be. I was visiting my aunt in a village called Rivenbrook, when 6 days of heavy rain caused the river to flood beyond anything the village had seen in living memory. The old stone bridge at the edge of town began to collapse, while a group of children were still crossing it, returning from an evening gathering at their church. A murmur moved through the crowd, curiosity beginning to overtake the earlier hostility in several faces nearby. Eleanor continued, drawing on the same clarity she had felt while retelling the story to Alistair weeks earlier, when the truth had finally begun to feel like something worth speaking aloud again. I waded into that flood because 6 children were trapped upon a collapsing bridge, and no one else moved quickly enough to help them. I was not fleeing an engagement, Lady Caroline, nor running from any scandal, as certain versions of this story have apparently suggested. I was pulling frightened children from freezing water while grown men stood frozen upon the shore. A touching story, Caroline said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, but rather difficult to verify. Wouldn't you agree, given that it happened so far from London and so long ago? It is not difficult to verify at all, Alistair said, stepping fully forward now, his voice carrying the calm, unshakable authority of a man entirely certain of his ground. "Because I was there as well." The murmur through the crowd grew louder, several guests exchanging startled glances at this unexpected revelation. Lady Caroline's composure faltered visibly for the first time. "My carriage broke down near Rivenbrook that same evening," Alistair continued, addressing the gathered crowd directly now rather than Lady Caroline alone. "I witnessed Miss Bright wade into that flood without a moment's hesitation, and I assisted her in pulling children from the wreckage as the bridge collapsed around us. I watched her sustain the injury that some of you have apparently mistaken for simple clumsiness these past weeks. As she broke her leg badly while saving the final child from that bridge, moments before the last section gave way entirely beneath the water." The hall had grown almost entirely silent now, every guest straining to hear the exchange unfolding at its center. Eleanor felt her pulse pounding, but she stood steady beside Alistair, grateful beyond words for his presence, for his willingness to risk his own reputation alongside hers, rather than watch her face this moment alone. 6 families in that village owe their children's lives to Miss Bright's courage that night, Alistair continued. "I have carried the memory of her bravery for 3 years, and I will not stand quietly by while careless gossip transforms that courage into scandal, simply because it suits someone's private grievances." Lady Caroline's face had gone quite pale, the confident smile entirely vanished now beneath the weight of dozens of watching eyes. She opened her mouth as though to offer some further defense, then seemed to think better of it, and instead offered only a stiff, shallow curtsy, before retreating quickly into the surrounding crowd. Her earlier triumph collapsed entirely into humiliation. Eleanor watched her go, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the full weight of her old secret finally lifting from her shoulders, replaced by something lighter and far more certain. Beside her, Alistair reached for her hand, and this time, in front of the entire watching hall, he did not let it go. The story spread through London faster than Lady Caroline's version ever had. By the following morning, every drawing room in the city seemed to be discussing the same remarkable tale, the true story of Miss Eleanor Bright's courage on the night of the Rivenbrook flood, confirmed not by rumor or second-hand gossip, but by the direct testimony of the Duke of Ambervale himself, delivered before a hall full of witnesses. The transformation in public opinion was almost dizzying in its speed. Ladies who had turned away from Eleanor only days before now sought her out at every opportunity, eager to hear the details of that terrible night firsthand. Invitations that had grown sparse began arriving again in greater numbers than before, though Eleanor found she approached them now with far less anxiety than she once had. "It is remarkable," her mother said one afternoon, reading through yet another invitation with an expression of bewildered delight, "how quickly the world's opinion can shift, once the truth is finally given room to breathe." "It should not have required a duke's testimony to make people believe me," Eleanor observed, though without real bitterness. The truth was always the truth, whether or not anyone chose to believe it. "No," her mother agreed, setting the invitation aside. "It should not have. But I confess, Eleanor, I am grateful nonetheless, and more than a little ashamed of how readily I once encouraged you to hide it." It was the closest thing to an apology her mother had ever offered, and Eleanor accepted it with the same quiet grace she had learned to bring to every difficult moment of the past 3 years. A letter arrived from her Aunt Margaret as well, the very woman who had nursed Eleanor through those first painful weeks after the accident, expressing her own quiet astonishment at how the story had finally reached London society in its true form. Word of the Duke's public testimony had traveled even as far as Rivenbrook itself, and several of the villagers whose children Eleanor had helped save wrote letters of their own, thanking her again for a courage they had never forgotten, whatever society elsewhere had once believed about the matter. One letter in particular moved Eleanor deeply, written in careful, uneven handwriting by the very girl she had pulled from the bridge in its final collapsing moments. The girl, now a young woman of 13, wrote to say she still remembered the strength of Eleanor's arms pulling her free of the current, still thought of that night whenever she crossed the new bridge the village had built to replace the old one. She had heard, she wrote, that Eleanor had faced cruel whispers in London for the very same act that had saved her life, and she wished to say, on behalf of her whole family, how grateful and how sorry she was that courage had ever been so poorly repaid. Eleanor read that letter several times, tears gathering in her eyes, and found herself, for the first time in 3 years, entirely at peace with the choice she had made that terrible night. Whatever London society had once believed, whatever cruelty she had endured in the years since, the truth remained simple and unshakable. She had saved 6 lives, and every one of those lives had gone on to grow and change and matter in the world, exactly as they should have. She kept the letter in a small box beside her bed, alongside a pressed flower from the Ambervale gardens and the first letter Alistair had ever sent her, small treasures marking the strange, winding path that had led her from a flooded river to the drawing room where her future now waited. Alistair called the following week, though this visit carried a different weight than any that had come before it. He arrived not with careful formality, but with a quiet nervousness Eleanor had never before seen from him, fidgeting slightly with his gloves as he waited in the drawing room for her to join him. "You seem troubled," Eleanor observed, settling into the chair across from him. "Has something happened?" "Nothing troubling," he assured her quickly. "Only something rather important, and I confess I find myself more nervous than I anticipated." He rose from his seat and moved toward the window, his back partially turned toward her in the same manner he had adopted during their first true conversation in his study, when the words had come easier without her watching eyes upon him. "I have spent 3 years carrying the memory of a woman who waded into a flood without hesitation," he began, "and these past weeks getting to know the fullness of who that woman truly is. Her courage on the bridge was extraordinary, but I find I am equally moved by her courage since, in facing down every cruel whisper society has thrown at her, in choosing honesty over the comfortable safety of continued silence." Eleanor's heart began to beat unsteadily, though she said nothing, sensing that he needed to finish whatever thought he had begun. "I do not wish to simply admire that courage from a respectful distance any longer, Eleanor. I wish to stand beside it, for the rest of my life, if you will have me." He turned to face her now, his earlier nervousness giving way to a steadiness she recognized from the night he had pulled her from the flooded river, unwavering despite the enormity of the moment. "I am asking you to marry me, not because society has finally decided to approve of your history, and not out of any obligation from that night 3 years ago, but because I have come to love you entirely, for exactly who you are, injury and courage and stubborn honesty all together." For a moment, Eleanor could not find her voice at all, the weight of his words settling over her like sunlight after a long, cold winter. She thought of the years of hiding, of the careful smiles and quiet apologies, of the mockery she had endured while carrying a secret too large and too painful to share. And she thought of this man, who had recognized her truth from the very first moment, who had risked his own reputation to defend her before all of London society, who now stood before her offering not tolerance or patient forgiveness, but genuine, unconditional love. "Yes," she said finally, her voice trembling with emotion. She no longer felt any need to hide. "Yes, Alistair, I will marry you." The relief and joy that broke across his face in that moment was unlike anything Eleanor had seen from him before, the careful composure he wore so consistently in public finally giving way entirely to open, unguarded happiness. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and took both her hands in his dark eyes bright with an emotion that needed no further words to explain itself. "You have made me the happiest man in London," he said softly, "though I confess I already suspected as much 3 years ago, standing in that flooded river, watching you refuse to let a single child drown while the rest of the world stood frozen in fear." News of their engagement spread through London society even faster than the story of the bridge itself had. Some, like Lady Caroline, offered only stiff, insincere congratulations before retreating from society's attention for the remainder of the season, her earlier cruelty having cost her far more standing than she had ever intended to lose. Others, particularly those who had once mocked Eleanor's clumsiness at that first feast, now competed eagerly for invitations to the wedding, eager to associate themselves with a story that had captured the imagination of the entire city. Eleanor found she cared little for either reaction. She had spent 3 years measuring her worth against society's shifting judgments, and she found, in the weeks leading up to her wedding, that she no longer had any interest in continuing that exhausting habit. What mattered now was the steady, unwavering regard of the man she had agreed to marry, and the quiet, hard-won peace she had finally found with the truth of her own history. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Eleanor found herself visited often by a strange, quiet disbelief, as though she were waiting for the fragile happiness she had found to somehow slip away, the way so much good fortune in her life had once seemed to slip away without warning. She confided this fear to Alistair one evening, as they walked together through the same garden paths that had witnessed so much of their courtship. "I keep expecting to wake and find it was only ever a dream," she admitted, watching the last light of evening fade behind the garden hedges. 3 months ago, I was a woman mocked for clumsiness at every gathering I attended. Now I am to become a duchess, married to a man who has shown me nothing but honesty and regard since the very night we met again. It feels almost too fortunate to be entirely real." Alistair took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers with the same steady confidence he had shown from their very first proper conversation in his study. I understand that fear better than you might imagine. I spent 3 years believing the woman who saved those children at Rivenbrook was simply a fading memory, a story I would carry alone for the rest of my life, without ever learning her name. Finding you again, learning the fullness of who you are, beyond that single extraordinary night, has felt like more good fortune than I ever expected to receive as well. Do you think happiness always feels this uncertain, even once it finally arrives? Perhaps, Alistair said thoughtfully, or perhaps it simply takes time to trust something good, after so many years of expecting only difficulty. I do not think the uncertainty means the happiness is any less real, Eleanor. I think it only means we have both learned, through hard experience, not to take good fortune for granted. Eleanor considered this as they continued walking, the truth of it settling comfortably into place alongside everything else she had learned these past months. Perhaps happiness did not need to feel entirely certain in order to be entirely real. Perhaps it was enough to simply keep walking forward, together, trusting that the ground beneath them, however new and unfamiliar, would continue to hold steady beneath their combined weight. Her wedding gown arrived the following week, a careful creation of ivory silk that her mother had commissioned from the finest modiste in London, and Eleanor stood for her final fitting with a mixture of nervous excitement and quiet wonder, hardly recognizing the composed, radiant woman reflected back at her in the mirror. Gone was the anxious girl who had once braced herself for every misstep at every ball. In her place stood someone steadier, someone who had finally learned to carry her history not as a burden to be hidden, but as a foundation strong enough to build an entire future upon. The wedding took place on a bright autumn morning, the gardens of Ambervale House transformed for the occasion with ribbons and flowers arranged along every path Eleanor had walked during those first careful weeks of courtship. Edmund walked her down the aisle, his pride evident in every careful step he took beside her, matching his pace to hers exactly as he always had, ensuring she never once stumbled on the uneven ground. Alistair waited for her at the end of the aisle, his expression carrying none of the careful reserve she remembered from their first meeting, only open, unguarded joy at the sight of her approaching through the golden autumn light. As she reached him, he took her hand and leaned close enough to speak words meant only for her. 3 years ago, I pulled you from a flooded river and called you brave, he murmured. Today, I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that I meant it. Eleanor smiled, feeling the old ache in her legs settle into something that no longer felt like a burden, but rather like the quiet, permanent proof of a night she would never regret, however much it had once cost her. And I intend to spend the rest of my life reminding you that we saved them together, Alistair. Just as we are building this life together now. The ceremony that followed was witnessed by nearly all of London society, gathered beneath the golden autumn sky to watch a duke marry a woman once mocked for her clumsiness, now celebrated for a courage that had waited 3 long years to finally be understood. Somewhere in the crowd, Eleanor's mother wept quiet, joyful tears, and Edmund grinned with unrestrained pride, and even a few of the ladies who had once whispered cruelly behind their fans found themselves genuinely moved by the sight of 2 people who had found their way to each other, across the impossible distance of time, chance, and a single terrible night none of them had ever expected to matter so much. As the ceremony concluded, and the guests began to move toward the celebration awaiting them in the great hall, Eleanor paused for a moment beside the old stone fountain in the garden, remembering the first walk she had taken along these same paths, uncertain and cautious, still learning to trust the strange, hopeful possibility that had begun unfolding before her. She thought of the bridge, of the cold water and the breaking stones, of the terror and the courage that had somehow, impossibly, led her to this exact moment. Alistair found her there a few minutes later, drawn by the same quiet instinct that had first noticed her standing alone by a window 3 months earlier, watching her with that same unreadable expression that had since become so familiar and so dear to her. "Regretting your decision already?" he asked, a teasing warmth in his voice that had grown more frequent since their engagement. "Never," Eleanor said, taking his offered arm. "I was only remembering how it all began. A collapsed bridge, a flooded river, and a stranger whose name I did not learn for 3 long years. And now?" "Now," Eleanor said, smiling, as they turned together toward the celebration waiting for them. "I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain I never forget it again." They walked back toward the great hall together, leaving the quiet garden behind them, ready at last to begin the next chapter of a story that had started, so many years ago, with an act of courage neither of them had ever expected the world to fully understand. Inside, the celebration had already begun in earnest, musicians tuning their instruments in the corner, while guests gathered around long tables laden with autumn fruit and fresh bread, and every delicacy the Ambervale kitchens could produce for such an occasion. Edmund found Eleanor almost immediately, pulling her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could of the quiet pride and relief he felt at seeing his sister finally settled into a happiness she had long deserved. "I believe I owe you an apology," he said, pulling back to study her face with a warm, teasing smile. "I once thought no man in London would ever prove himself worthy of you. I am pleased to admit I was wrong." "You were only being protective," Eleanor said, laughing despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I would not have wanted a brother who was any less careful with my happiness." Her mother approached soon after, her earlier caution entirely dissolved into open, unrestrained joy, embracing Eleanor with a warmth that seemed to erase, at least for this one golden afternoon, every difficult conversation they had shared over the past 3 years. "You look radiant, my darling. I do not think I have ever seen you look so entirely at peace." "I feel it, Mother. For the first time in a very long while, I feel it completely." As the afternoon stretched into evening, Eleanor found herself pulled into dance after dance, her earlier fear of stumbling before a crowded room entirely absent now, replaced by a steady confidence that came not from any sudden cure to her old injury, but from a simple, hard-won understanding that her worth had never depended on perfect grace in the first place. When her leg occasionally faltered during a particularly lively reel, Alistair simply steadied her with a quiet hand at her waist, and the moment passed without a single whisper of mockery, without a single unkind glance from anywhere in the watching crowd. Later, as the celebration finally began to wind down and the last of the guests took their leave beneath a sky scattered with early evening stars, Eleanor stood once more at the edge of the garden, watching the lanterns flicker gently along the familiar paths where so much of her courtship had unfolded. Alistair joined her there, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulders as they looked out together over the quiet grounds of what was now, at last, entirely her home as well. "A long road," he murmured, "from a flooded river to this garden." "A road worth every difficult step," Eleanor replied, leaning into his warmth. "I would not change a single moment of it, however painful parts of that journey once were. Every stumble, every whisper, every quiet night of doubt led me exactly here, to exactly this life, beside exactly the right person." They stood together in comfortable silence as the stars grew brighter overhead, two people bound together by courage, by honesty, and by a bridge that had collapsed one terrible night 3 years ago, only to become, in the end, the very foundation upon which their entire future had been built. The invitation had come from the village itself, a formal letter signed by the local vicar and nearly every family whose children had once been trapped upon that collapsing bridge, requesting the honor of the Duke and Duchess of Ambervale's presence at the dedication of a small stone memorial beside the new crossing, built to commemorate the night the old bridge had fallen and the lives that had been saved despite it. Eleanor read the letter twice before showing it to Alistair, who took it from her hands with the same quiet seriousness he brought to every matter that touched upon that long-ago night. "We should go," he said simply, and Eleanor found she agreed entirely. The journey north took the better part of 2 days, the countryside slowly shifting from London's crowded streets into the gentler, greener landscape Eleanor remembered from her youth. She found herself watching the passing fields with a strange mixture of anticipation and old, half-buried nervousness, memories of that terrible night rising unbidden as the carriage drew closer to the village she had not seen in 3 years. Rivenbrook had changed since her last visit, though many of its familiar landmarks remained exactly as she remembered them. The old church still stood at the center of the village green, its bell tower catching the afternoon light exactly as it had on the night of the flood. Her Aunt Margaret's cottage remained too, though a new family now occupied it, the elderly woman having passed peacefully in her sleep just the previous winter, a loss that had struck Eleanor deeply despite the distance that had grown between them over the years. The new bridge itself stood a short distance from where the old one had once crossed the river, built higher and stronger against future floods, its stone foundations solid and unyielding beneath the gentle current that flowed past it now, calm and unremarkable in the autumn afternoon light. Beside it stood the small memorial the village had commissioned, a simple stone marker inscribed with the names of every person who had helped save the 6 children trapped that terrible night, Eleanor's name carved alongside Alistair's near the very top of the list. The village had gathered in considerable numbers for the dedication, farmers and shopkeepers and families Eleanor barely remembered from her brief time in their community 3 years earlier, all eager to witness the ceremony honoring a night that had shaped so many of their lives. Among the crowd, Eleanor spotted a familiar face, now grown taller and more composed than the frightened child she remembered pulling from the collapsing bridge. "Miss Bright," the young woman said, approaching with careful, respectful steps, though warmth shone clearly in her expression. "Or your grace, I suppose I ought to say now." "Eleanor is still quite acceptable," Eleanor replied, smiling as she recognized the girl from her letter, the very child whose rescue had cost Eleanor the injury she still carried. "You have grown so much since I last saw you." "I think of that night often," the young woman admitted, glancing toward the new bridge with an expression that carried both old fear and quiet gratitude in equal measure. "I do not think I properly understood, as a child, exactly what you risked to save me. I understand it far better now." "You do not owe me anything for that night," Eleanor said gently. "I would do the very same again, without a moment's hesitation, exactly as I did then." "I know," the young woman said. "That is precisely why the whole village wished to build this memorial. Not because you asked for recognition, but because you never once seemed to want it, even when it would have been so easy to claim it for yourself." The dedication ceremony that followed was simple but deeply moving, the vicar speaking briefly of courage and sacrifice before inviting Eleanor and Alistair forward to unveil the memorial together. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion as the cloth covering the stone finally fell away, revealing the carved names beneath, her own included among the villagers and strangers who had worked together that terrible night to save 6 young lives from the flood. Afterward, as the crowd slowly dispersed toward a modest celebration organized in the village hall, Eleanor found herself walking alone toward the riverbank, drawn by some old, unfinished need to stand once more at the place where everything had changed so completely 3 years before. The water flowed gently now, nothing like the furious, churning current she remembered from that night, and she found herself grateful for the calm, for the quiet proof that even the most violent storms eventually passed, leaving something steadier and more peaceful in their wake. Alistair found her there a short while later, settling beside her without a word, his presence as steady and comforting now as it had been on the very night they first met, pulling children from a flood neither of them had ever expected to face. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly, after a long moment of shared silence. "The injury, the years of hiding, everything that night cost you before it finally led you here?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, watching the water move past them toward the sea, carrying with it 3 years of pain and silence, and, eventually, the fragile beginnings of a happiness she had never expected to find. "No," she said finally, with complete certainty. "I do not regret a single moment of it, however difficult the path proved to be. That night taught me something about myself I might never have otherwise learned, that I was capable of courage even when everything within me was afraid, that I could act decisively even when the cost was uncertain and possibly severe. I carried that lesson through every difficult moment since, through every cruel whisper and every lonely night of hiding. And in the end, it led me to you." Alistair reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers exactly as he had so many times since that first true conversation in his study, when the truth had finally found room to breathe between them after 3 long years of silence. "I do not regret it either," he said softly. "Though I confess, I wish I could have spared you some of the pain that followed. I wish society had recognized your courage immediately, rather than requiring 3 years and a great deal of unnecessary cruelty before the truth was finally given its proper due." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, "but I think I needed those years too, in their own strange way. I needed to learn how to carry my own worth without requiring society's approval to validate it. I do not think I would have recognized your love so clearly, when it finally arrived, if I had not first learned to recognize my own strength without it." They sat together by the riverbank as the afternoon light softened into evening, watching the water flow steadily past the new bridge and the small stone memorial that would stand, now, as permanent testament to a night neither of them would ever forget. Eventually, as the sky began to deepen toward twilight, they rose together and made their way back toward the village, hand in hand, ready to rejoin the celebration awaiting them. Their carriage departed Rivenbrook the following morning, carrying them back toward London and the life they had built together there, though Eleanor found herself glancing back one final time as the village disappeared behind them, watching the new bridge grow smaller in the distance until it vanished entirely from view. She thought, as the carriage rolled steadily south, of everything that single terrible night had ultimately given her, however much it had first demanded in return. A husband who loved her entirely, injury and courage and stubborn honesty together, a brother whose loyalty had never once wavered, even through the darkest whispers of that difficult season, a mother who had finally learned to value truth over careful appearance, and a quiet, hard-won peace with her own history, one she suspected she would carry, gratefully, for the rest of her life. The old bridge was gone now, swept away by a flood 3 years past, and replaced by something newer and stronger in its place. But the courage it had demanded that terrible night remained, carved now into stone beside the gentle river, and carried always within Eleanor herself, a permanent reminder that even the most frightening storms could, in time, lead somewhere unexpectedly beautiful. 2 months after their return from Rivenbrook, Eleanor discovered she was carrying a child, news that filled Ambervale House with a fresh and different kind of joy than any it had known before. Alistair received the news with the same quiet, overwhelmed wonder he had shown on the evening of his proposal, holding her carefully, as though she had suddenly become something even more precious than she already was, though he was careful, at her gentle insistence, not to treat her leg or her condition as any greater fragility than either had ever truly been. Her mother wept with happiness upon hearing the news, already making plans for the nursery long before Eleanor herself had begun to properly consider such details, and Edmund declared with characteristic humor that he fully intended to teach his future niece or nephew every piece of mischief he had once inflicted upon Eleanor during their own childhood together. The months that followed passed in a gentle, contented rhythm, Eleanor dividing her time between the quiet comforts of Ambervale House and the growing responsibilities of her new position within society, no longer approaching each gathering with the old anxious dread that had once shadowed every step. When her leg occasionally faltered, as it still sometimes did, she no longer felt the need to apologize or explain, and she found, to her quiet satisfaction, that most of society had long since stopped expecting her to. Their daughter arrived the following spring, on a morning bright with new sunlight, a small and fierce presence who announced her arrival with a cry loud enough to be heard throughout the entire house. Alistair wept openly when he first held her, something Eleanor had never once seen from him in all their time together, and she found herself laughing through her own exhausted tears at the sight of her composed, careful husband so thoroughly undone by love. They named her Margaret, after the aunt who had nursed Eleanor through her darkest days, and Eleanor made certain, from the very earliest days of her daughter's life, that she would grow up knowing the true story of the bridge, of courage and sacrifice, and the long, difficult road toward a truth finally spoken aloud. She wanted her daughter to understand that strength did not always look graceful, that courage sometimes left permanent marks upon a person, and that neither of those things ever diminished a person's worth in the slightest. Standing at the nursery window one quiet evening, watching Alistair rock their daughter gently to sleep in the fading light, Eleanor found herself thinking once more of that terrible night 3 years past, of cold water and breaking stone and a stranger's steady hands pulling her toward safety. She thought of every difficult year that had followed, every cruel whisper and every lonely night of silence, and found that she could look back upon all of it now not with regret, but with a quiet, grateful understanding of exactly how far that single act of courage had ultimately carried her. The bridge had fallen, but everything built afterward, upon the foundation of that single brave night, had proven far sturdier than anyone watching the flood that evening could ever have possibly imagined.